them down to have a conversation with them. And the other side of that, a video that's captured something that looks like it's an excessive use of force. But all these aspects of it, and it's very difficult to control that story. The story takes a lot of life of its own. So we have, these moments in time. So police leaders become concerned about wanting to celebrate those wonderful moments, but also getting concerned about the morale and that implication, that impact on police officers when there's such criticism from the media. And we've seen these pictures all over the place. You think of a lot of events happening in the US and Canada, and really strong, and other parts of the world too, really strong backlash against the police. It affects people inside. Right? The majority of police officers want to come in and do something. They want to make a difference. So these things are really very difficult. But again, these are things that are in the minds of police leaders that are thinking about that. And so we get to this point that what we see is that procedural justice really matters, right? We know now, and especially it's coming out certainly from a new generation, but how we treat people inside and outside matters. And that's the heart of the conversation we're really going to have about in terms of the change initiatives. How do you treat people really well? How do you value everybody in your organization and all the differences and all the status type scenarios that are happening from sworn and unsworn and junior and senior, and the people that are working investigations, the people working patrol? How do you treat everybody fairly and make them see that they have a part of your organization? So what we're thinking about and what we get into very briefly is that because of all this changing reality around us, and again, we're focusing on policing, but it really dictates that we need to think about doing things differently. And you've heard wonderful stories this week of different things that are being done in different types of organizations, whether it's related to gender, whether it's related to different types of sort of tactical opportunities and approaches, et cetera, relationships with communities. But it means now when we think about change, how we used to go about change, and we know that how we go about change hasn't always been successful. How many here have had a really great successful change opportunity? It worked so well, hands down. Right on, right? Right on. We'll take a picture of her in the room. But we know though, so we know that generally, so the way we've been doing things in terms of change, they're not working, right? And so the literature will say that roughly around 70% of all change initiatives never achieve their intended outcomes. Wow, right? And that's not something unique to policing. So what we want to do, and what we're going to share with you, is the idea of thinking about, and you've seen lots of stuff around change, and every type of person coming out and tell you a different type of story, here's a process to follow. What we want to walk you through is a little bit of, here's an abbreviated model to think about from the aspect, and we're going to sort of describe and share their stories in line with this sort of model. So think about, really at the heart of change is understanding, where are you starting from? Because it's easy to see something like, we got a lot of harassment happening. We got a lot of bullying happening in our organization. We've got X happening. Those are symptoms. What's the real issue? So we're going to spend some time like, how do you get at finding out what's going on? And it really comes from asking the right, beautiful questions and listening to the answers. Really listening to the answers. And from there you move in then to how do you get your people ready? How do you get yourselves, your organization, and your people in your organization ready to sort of follow you on that journey of change? Right? Because you got to bring people along. You can order them, but you'll never get their hearts and minds. You'll just get compliance. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about stages 1 and 2. Obviously, from there you develop, execute your strategy. Here you're getting into this point of monitoring, evaluating progress. Bill will have a little bit more on stages 3 and 4, but we're really going to spend a ton of time just on 1 and 2. And you can see from, if you look at that abbreviated model, half of your focus is just in the front end of driving transformation. And I'll get into a little bit more, but half of it is invested in there, in that piece. And what do we like to do, people in a law enforcement role? What do we like to do when presented with an issue? Solve it. And in what time frame? Right now, right? And the shortest path possible, A to B, move on because there's another issue burning. That doesn't work, we all know that. Right? So it's kind of what's the definition of insanity? Keep trying to do the same thing over and over and over again. So I want you to think about, so I'm going to join my colleagues over here, and we want to engage in a little bit of dialogue, and I want you to listen to the stories. And the reason I invited them, as I said, I've worked with them. They're good leaders, but first and foremost, they're good people. They're really good people, so I encourage you to ask lots of questions. For them, they're concerned about, they want you to hear their story, but I'm going to really kind of push them to get into how their experiences have affected them. So let's get started. And So what I'm gonna do is jump over here and just, can you hear this? Yeah. Okay. And so part of it is, we're gonna spend time really on the first and second part, because again, that's, as I mentioned, that's where the challenges are, that's where you really struggle. So I'm gonna ask Bill in terms of, because he stepped into a bit of a fire pit, we'll say, maybe I'm kind of ad-libbing a little bit, but I'm gonna ask Bill to actually just explain a little bit of, share the context of when you stepped into your role as basically Chief of Police in the city of Surrey.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Maybe before I do that, if I could, I'd like to echo Angela's comments earlier about the fact that it's really a privilege for us to be here today amongst you, and I confess we feel somewhat intimidated following the presentations we've seen so far. So maybe just to jump back to her question about the scenario that I jumped into. In 2012, I came from a background of criminal investigations. I'd spent my entire career working in major crime. I was a polygraph examiner. I worked on an integrated homicide investigation team. In other words, I'd been involved in what I would call tactical or more operational leadership or management. And I was asked to participate in a selection process to be essentially the chief of police in Surrey. And I did that thinking that I was well equipped to jump into that arena. Over, I guess, the next 18 months, I lost a police officer that worked for me, and to this day, the single hardest thing I've ever had to try to manage, because there's no playbook, or there's no manual on how to lead a detachment or a police service through that when you're walking into the office at 5 in the morning and the people are lying on the floor crying. And then we had 30 murders in my first 18 months, shootings every week. I had a team of people working in Surrey that were overworked. We were under-resourced. I was in the RCMP in British Columbia. They do the equivalent of the federal policing, the provincial policing, and the municipal policing. So as a result of that, there's significant political pressure placed on the leaders of the municipal detachments, because you're a part of the narrative at every election. So the 30th murder, under my tenure as the leader there, was Julie Pascal. She was a mother who dropped her son off at an arena, and she was an innocent victim of a horrible, senseless, pathetic, cowardly crime. And really, if I was to look back on where I believe, in hindsight, that I started to transform as a leader, it was there. It was the recognition that I could no longer continue from a tactical or an operational perspective. I needed to transition to a strategic leader to deal with the political pressure, to try to better serve the men and women that I had the privilege of working with, and ultimately to better serve the community that we were commissioned to serve.
And so Bill and I, obviously, I was at one end of the country, and of course he's out west, and so we knew each other, well, only by name, probably me more him. But so part of it, as I understood, you were the top dog in terms of, you think about really complex investigations and his experience. And so you're stepping into this role that you talk about, and obviously there's a lot of stuff going on, were you scared of that? Was there anything about that role and what you saw going from what you knew as a comfort, really comfort place for you, and then stepping out, was there anything that really, sort of scared you as a leader that you were kind of worried about?
I didn't know what I didn't know. I think at the 18-month mark, it was really around that point that I started to concern myself with how well I was doing as a leader. And, to be honest, if I was failing as a leader because of the crime, because of the morale in the RCMP was process, I think if I look at your slides, that would fall within number one, where we were trying to identify ways that we could improve. We didn't know at that point where we were going to go, but I knew we needed to go somewhere. And I was fortunate that I had extremely good people that ultimately stood beside me along the way, every step of the way.
So if we think about, in terms of the audience here, so we think about your experience really was, you talked about, lots of murders, you got morale issues, you got political pressure. And I know, and Bill shared this story before, which I think is quite hilarious. Going into the mayor, and so we're really talking about where you gotta dig deep and get the evidence. Can you share that conversation with the mayor? Because you told me, and I think it's, now I'm just kind of blown at everything. It's not really that fun.
I had a very strong mayor. I think she was rated number 2 in the world that I studied at Diane Watts. And the way that I described that conversation is I went in to her and I said, I have a feeling I need more people. And she said, well, I have a feeling you don't. And she was very strong. She controlled her council. She controlled her police committee. And at that point, I thought to myself, okay, it used to be a real cop, or used to be about going and getting evidence. So I embarked upon 2 studies. I reached out to the University of the Fraser Valley. I brought them in to do a complete analysis of our service delivery review. And I reached out to an American criminologist by the name of Peter Belmio to come in and help us do a workload assessment of our service so that we could gather evidence to ultimately take back to the mayor and council. In my heart, I knew we needed more people. That didn't matter. I needed evidence and data to support that notion.
And so I'm going to reach over to Brian a little bit, because we can see a little bit just in the context, and we're going to come back and forth quite a bit. And again, if you get questions, jump back. But in terms of, so you get a little bit of context here for Bill, really what he's been told is, you have an idea that you need this, but you've got to look at the data. And I think for yours is really, when you talk a little bit about the employee surveys, is any people here like reading the employee survey results? Anybody like getting survey results when they're about you? Right? So some of that feedback is really uncomfortable, and I think that's part of Bill's process, is gathering some of that data that can be a bit of an identity threat to a leader to think, I'm not doing a good job, we're not doing a great job, because we're getting feedback from people that are saying this is not a good place to work. And what Bill didn't add is that Surrey detachment, and I even knew this from in Canada, even when I started out, is you don't want to go to Surrey, British Columbia. You don't want to go to Surrey detachment. You're going to do time. You're never going to get out. You're like 9-10 years before they let you go. And I think that was his starting point of all of this context in there, like this is just not a good place to be. And Bill's just really incredibly humble and saying, and he's already shared that a little bit, I didn't know what I didn't know, right? And so we're gonna jump over to Brian a little bit. And sort of Brian, I just want you sort of similar to Bill, is provide your context in terms of, in your experience and actually stepping into the role of chief of police, and you could paint that picture a little bit for folks too, and just we're gonna contrast the differences.
Sure. Excuse me. So there's no trapeze that's going to drop down. I'm not going to do a Patrick Chan impression here.
Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. So in Niagara, we just put it into context. I think everybody has heard of Niagara Falls, one of the 7 wonders of the world. About 450,000 residents that we have in Niagara. About 15 to 20 million visitors a year that come to Niagara. So lots of unique challenges, bordered by water on 3 sides, 4 international border crossings. So I was born and raised in Niagara. Started with the service when I was 20 years old and kind of worked my way up through the ranks. Was deputy chief. And had a front row seat to what was going on at the time. Our chief at the time, Jeff McGuire, had his hands full with our board. I would just leave it at that. They didn't like him. It was quite apparent. Members in our service saw the deteriorating relationship between the board and our chief. In their wisdom, they live streamed the video of all of our board meetings, so everybody within the service got to had I done my full 3-year term, full 5-year term as deputy, I would have walked out the door a month before Jeff had he done his full term as chief. And then suddenly, I'm thrust into the role of Jeff leaves on July 14th and July 15th. I'm the acting chief. Congratulations. So it was, and it happened very quickly. So that was the context of our change, and our board took an enormous amount of heat for paying out such a large sum of money to our chief to essentially go away. So there was pressure internal that was placed on me and Bill. I just met Bill at that time. Bill, I think, joined June 29th. When you were sworn in with us. And so this is July 14th now, Jeff leaves. Congratulations, you're in the role, and this is your new deputy, and you've got an acting.
He's mounting from BC.
Yeah, mounting from BC.
Good luck.
And Brett Flynn, who, again, born and raised in Niagara, but had spent his entire career with the Niagara Regional Police Service, is appointed as the acting deputy chief. So the three of us, the three Bs, if you will, have got to kind of get our collective act together pretty quickly. And as Bill pointed to earlier, there's no playbook in any of this. There's no book that you can read. There's no movie. You couldn't have scripted this the way it played out, but that's the context.
And just if you're wondering about the 3Bs, so I've been working with them for the last year, and so there's Bill, Brett, and Brian, and you're like, oh, you're tripping over your tongue, 3Bs, right? The 3Bs, I'm going to meet the 3Bs. The 3Bs are coming out. So Brian, in terms of your context, and I want you to explain a little bit, really, because around this front-end piece, and a lot of times, again, certainly there's been a cultural shift in terms of leadership, and in some organizations still today, certainly organizations I've been working with, there's sort of the old adage that senior leaders know best, right? Senior leaders know best. We'll consult, but we really know best. And I know that certainly from you, Brian, that was a deliberate effort that you made to really get out. You just share a little bit with people, with the audience here, so some of the steps that you did actually to really engage and listen to people to understand more what was happening in the organization. You, Brian, is effectively, and Bill, and the third B, have spent almost a year in step one, just really around this, right? Can you just get into that a little bit, in terms of your approach that you took?
Sure. So first and foremost, we had a terrible working relationship with our board, and I saw firsthand as deputy that the simplest of things that we were trying to get approved in the organization were not being approved, or were being debated to death, and put forward another report on this, and it was really demoralizing for us as an organization to things that we have the provincial adequacy standards in Ontario, which really capture what in essence you're supposed to provide at a minimum as a police service, and that didn't seem to matter at the time to our board. So it was really about, that first step was to improve the relationship with our board, and what that meant was having more informal discussions with them to provide the context around what it is that we have to do. There was, as I mentioned before, there was pressure on the board to try and reduce costs, to try and justify the rationale for paying out a large sum of money for our chief to go away. And at the time, we were not in a position to be cutting further costs. So it was, again, trying to have those one-on-one relationships with our board to put into context what was going on. Secondly, it was about the association. In our association, I know the associations can often be perceived as being difficult to deal with, but the reality is they're not going away anytime soon. So we took it upon ourselves to really enhance the relationship with the association. Now, I must admit I had an easier time, I think, than Jeff McGuire did with our association. Jeff was an outsider, or viewed as an outsider, came from Toronto Police, and three of our last 4 chiefs were external chiefs that were hired. So for the association, I was somebody that was born and bred in Niagara and grew up through the organization. So I had a better handle, not maybe better is not necessarily the word, but I had a good understanding of the organization and the issues that we were faced with. So enhancing that relationship with the association was key. And we'd had workload studies, we'd had internal member studies that had been done, and probably the last 4 internal studies that we had done really highlighted the communication within the organization as being a deficit. And so in enhancing the communication within the organization, messages from the chief on a regular basis, having town hall meetings, and really, I'm not a egocentric type of individual, so me getting up in front of a large group is not something that I aspire to, but putting myself out there in front of the organization to basically hear from them firsthand what the issues are and what we can do to address those issues collectively, I think was very well received, and that was part of the strategy that we used.
You go ahead.
What I would add to that, I was gonna ask it as a question, but I think I'll pose it more as a statement, is that somebody coming in from the outside, my observation was there was a lack of trust. If you were to sum it, break it right down, there was an absence of trust between the different parts of the service. And I think what Brian has done is he has, through the manner that he's chosen to lead, he is regaining the trust not only of the board, but of the senior leadership team and of the association and the community, frankly, that we serve. So if I was to provide my assessment of that, I would say it was about trust.
That's fair. So, I mean, certainly with the board and the association, there was definitely a lack of trust.
And so, and part of it, and so expand a little bit, really on this step 1. And so you see, step 1 is really about, again, going back to what do we want to do? We want to solve things really fast. And so part of it was, there's things that you can assume, and you think about your level in the organization, you have a different perspective, and your experiences are going to be different than someone on another team, someone on another level, etc. And so part of it is really, really thinking about what are those really good questions to ask. So part of the role that I had in working with Bill and Brian and during this first phase with them was actually going out. So this is kind of the fun that I have in my role now, is going out and talking to people. And I see the Staff Sergeant Kim McAllister's hiding in the back there. But I meet really amazing leaders and organizations, but I hear some of the issues. And I'm just going to give an example of something they did. I'm going to ask you to comment on it, so your thoughts on it. So something they did, and so a lot of times when you think about leaders, there's pressure that you don't show weakness. You don't admit you don't know the answer. You're all these things of kind of leaders feel. And so I went out to one of the districts and a group of people. So I was out early in the morning, late at night, and listened to a lot of different stories and experiences, really what was happening around them. And people just wanted to share their story. They wanted to talk about things that they were concerned with. And this one particular district was, they had some leadership shifts. So they were really, really angry. Like they were angry. There's a lot of cynicism. Really some strong remarks about the organization. But it was interesting, in the context, they still, they're seeing things about, obviously, what the 3 Bs were doing that, was starting to convince them that maybe things would be a little bit different. But notwithstanding that, they were really, really angry. And so I came back in and had a conversation with Bill, and then, for a further dialogue from that. And I said, you know what, I think this might be a situation you might want to go out and talk to that group. And there's, a corporal and the constables, a team of members that are just angry. So you might want to go out and talk to them. And I never heard anything more about it, right? So I thought, I'm going to just kind of launch this idea and sort of see what happens. I think it was 2 days later, popping up in the morning, about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I have an email and the subject line was, "We had visitors." And so it was one of the constables in the team that spoke about, thank you, first of all, for sharing, conveying our concerns to the chief. And not only the chief came, the 2 deputies came as well, and I think you were there at 6 o'clock in the morning, so you're getting up pretty early to be there for 6 o'clock in the morning. But their message to me was very much like they were so impressed. They heard us, they listened to us, they actually were easy to talk to, not these big ogre type characters. If you watch Shrek, anybody seen Shrek? dating myself now. But they're commenting on, but they're not these really difficult people. And their final sort of message to that was, but we actually think they're committed. So when you really get into thinking about creating readiness for change, you start to move into a phase 2 as you're gathering data. So both things are happening at that time. Because one thing, I mean, how many change initiatives do you think in your own organization you've been through? How many? Right? And right, you can't even list them all over and over and over again. And you feel like, anybody ever see the movie Groundhog Day? We're living Groundhog Day again, same type of sort of experiences. So there's all these, so part of it, when you hear someone talking about, we're gonna fix this, I'm gonna implement change, they're like, what's your response? Yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah. I've seen that, you tried that 10 years ago, and that didn't work, I was here, you're new, you don't know. So this is some of the feedback. So part of the steps that they're taking here is you gotta get people to, one, you can say a lot of great things, people are gonna pay attention to what you do. So this is why they're like, wow, they come out. And so I was gonna ask you if you could share, one, what you're thinking around that, but I know, Brian, that was sort of something, when you commented on sort of that experience. So, so can you share a little bit of your thinking around doing that, and then your experience of having that sort of, face-to-face contact with those members, especially, you don't have to give sort of context to the concerns, but.
Sure, so,
A lot of coffee that day.
yeah, and it actually kind of bore out. We do the Coffee with the Cop initiative. I'm sure a lot of people in the room do the same, where they go out in the community and they hear the feedback from members of the community, what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong. And we were missing the point when we should be having coffee with cops and finding out exactly what the issues are firsthand and getting information that's unfiltered from the members, and they can in turn get messages from us that are unfiltered as well. And so that was the initiative that we have embarked on, and so not only did we go out to that district and heard feedback from them, we're able to put into context to them. And in policing, we're terrible at this as organizations in terms of, we don't know the information or the answer to certain things. We make it up, and the rumor mill gets circulating, and before you know it, 25 people are being transferred and there's a new unit being started. And so it was an opportunity for us to really have that unfiltered communication one-on-one. It was Bill and Brian talking to the platoon, and it was Bill can provide his context on that as well.
I think you did a great job, boss. No, I think it was just an opportunity, and we went out with the objective and the understanding from the position that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We are going to listen more than we speak, so that we have a clear understanding. And the thing that I remember about that is, in particular, is we showed up and there was a senior officer there, a senior person with a lot of service. We walked in and, he wasn't shaking hands. He wasn't very welcoming. I was a former polygraph examiner, so I was maybe overanalyzing it, but, and at the end of that discussion, he stuck his hand out and said, it was really great for you guys to come. And so, I guess the point of that for me, I guess my message is, we hear a lot about culture, and that this service needs to change its culture, or that service needs to change its culture. What I would say is, organizations don't change, people change. And if as leaders we approach it on a one basis, and we change the actions of each person, then the actions will change the culture. I think that's what we saw that day. We saw a change in one person, who was, by the way, a very influential person within that group, which changed the behavior of that entire team.
So just continuing sort of with our little bit of conversation around, so if you think about, whatever sort of change you're looking at initiating or leading in your roles, it's so much time around this first part again. It's the questions, it's listening for the answer. But sometimes, especially in a senior leadership role, and I think many of you that are in a senior leadership role, when you get that data, as I mentioned earlier, when you get that feedback, it's about, so what does it mean to you, and what are you going to do about it? But also a big part of that is you need to get your senior leadership team on board with you. And we've all seen it. We've all seen it. We've heard the top, so the top leaders say we're going to do this, and others are there, yeah, I'm not buying into this. And you see it. It happens, quite visibly. So I'd actually be curious in terms of both your experiences and, gathering that data, getting that information, the good, the bad, the ugly out of it. There's always some context that's pretty good. So what are some steps that you did? Obviously, you're both kind of passionate about what you want to do. But what are some steps that you did actually to bring your senior leadership team on board, really recognizing that that's your starting point, to acknowledge it, and to own it as a senior leadership team?
Well, sorry, the first thing that we did is we had 4 sessions with all NCOs, meaning sergeants on, and we had them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of 1 week, and I had scheduled to be there the one day, the first day. And, initially, we had Dr. Eli Sopo help, and then during that process, I reached out to Angela, who's also a PhD, and brought her in to help with that process, recognizing that I needed help. In spite of the fact that I was the leader, I certainly didn't have the answers. And my plan was to sit in on the one session, and then, my schedule was set for the rest of the week. But at the end of that session, I was so taken by the honest dialogue that was being shared amongst the team that I asked the person who was having my schedule to cancel all my meetings that I wanted to come, to cancel the meetings for the next day. I wanted to come back again to hear everybody. And then at the end of the next day, I ended up coming back for all 4 days so that I could hear everything that was being said. And then at the end of that, we had a debriefing. I'm pretty sure you were there for that. And we said, this isn't enough. We need to have every person that works in this attachment part of that narrative. And so, that was, at that time, 900 people. So we arranged, I went and bought some fresh salmon to try to bribe Angela to come back.
Worked.
Yeah. And she came back, and we did 9 more sessions where we had every person in the service come in. And our biggest challenge, and I think it's a challenge in every organization, was to park certain issues. Like there's a tendency in the RCP, which is the federal service, to blame things on Ottawa. And what I wanted to do was to take that off the table, to park those issues in one small corner, and then focus on the things that we could actually do. And I would say in the municipal policing world, it's easy to blame the collective agreement or the adequacy standards or the Police Act. But there are still things in every service that you have control over as a leader in the service. That was our goal, and I think through that process, ultimately we developed a bit of a strategy, which I guess I should stop now and just answer the question you asked me.
He's a good soldier. And so part of what you'll hear from Bill a little bit is the idea is, and I highly recommend that. I do a lot of work with executive leadership outside of policing as well, and you hear such similar stories and the concerns and the fears that leaders have. But one of the things I talk about is you really you sort of narrow the distance between yourself and your people, right? Really sort of bridge that gap. And it's difficult sometimes because you got to take off the mask, because as leaders, in senior leadership role, it's very difficult. Some people don't want to show that degree of vulnerability, but you need to. So it's taking off that mask, but it's connecting with people and providing a forum where you can listen to them. And so the thing that was really, again, in this sort of first part of this that Bill was doing was, and I could actually almost at the end of day 4 recite Bill's story. I saw him every day. He was coming in sort of thing. It was a good story. I'm just kidding. But he was coming in every day and sort of sharing his story in terms of the audience, but he came in at the beginning, I'm here, I care about this, I canceled my schedule, he came at the end, and he's listened to the concerns that people shared. So, he could have easily just left it to the survey, left it to, kind of continue on and do the things that he wanted to do. But it very much was, and he's quite humble, as you can tell, but he really just spent so much time, and again, all I thought, here I'm knowing this guy's a big homicide guy, right? He's the guy, like the polygraph guy, he's the guy. And he comes in and he's such an incredible, humble leader. So he was working on getting at the heart of what the issues are, but also getting people to see that I care about what's actually happening here, that I canceled my schedule. I'm in every morning, and I'm in at the end of every session to hear what you have to say. So very interesting part around that. So that's one thing I really encourage you to do. Find ways to think how can you could just sort of bridge the distance between yourselves and the people you're responsible for in terms of finding out what's actually happening. Brian, can you share that a little bit in terms of, because you had an opportunity, as I know, to actually pick your team and sort of, bring the right people around you. And Brian, can you share in terms of so you're really at the end of kind of year one, still here, step one. Can you share a little bit how you talk about thinking, how do you get your leadership team sort of, working and going where you think you might want to go?
So the context, I think, is important as well, because at the time, Bill is a newly minted deputy chief with the organization from the RCMP. There had been some superintendents that had competed for that position and were not successful in that competition. And now here I am standing in front of the senior management team, them not knowing if I'm going to be the chief or if I'm just an acting chief. So lots of dynamics at play. So I think it was within the first month that we decided